I've been a hospice doctor for over 30 years. In that time, I've sat beside hundreds, maybe thousands of people at the end of their lives. Some slipped away quietly after years of living with a long, exhausting illness. Others had just begun to process the shock of a diagnosis when the final days arrived. Every one of them taught me something. Every one of them left a mark. I remember a young woman once holding her father's hand. He had just been diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer, and she looked at me and asked, "Doctor, how will he die? Will it be fast? Will it hurt? What can I do to prepare?" She wasn't asking out of fear alone. She wanted to love him the right way, even through the hardest part. A few months later, I heard a similar question, but from a very different place. This time, it was a woman who had spent 20 years caring for her husband with Alzheimer's. She sat at his bedside and said softly, "Does he even know I'm here, doctor? What should I do now?" Those kinds of questions, honest, tender, deeply human, are what have moved me to speak more clearly about the dying process. You see, death may be the shared destination, but not everyone walks the same road to get there. Some paths are steep and sudden. Others stretch long and wind slowly. And each kind of journey requires a different kind of understanding and care from the people who walk alongside. What I want to offer you now is not a lecture, but a reflection, one shaped by the stories I've lived through with patients and families. I want to explain the difference between what it looks like to die from an acute illness versus a chronic one, especially within the world of hospice care. Because when we understand the shape of the path, we walk it with more peace, more presence, and a little less fear. Some of the people I meet come to hospice care after a sudden, steep decline. They've been relatively well, or at least functional up until recently, maybe just a few months or even weeks. Often it's a diagnosis like advanced pancreatic or lung cancer. Sometimes it's liver cancer or a rapidly progressing brain tumor. These are what we call acute illnesses. The word acute doesn't mean the pain is sharp, though it often is, but that the disease comes on quickly and moves fast. There's a sense of urgency, a visible momentum to the decline. I think of Mr. H, a retired teacher in his early 70s. He had been playing golf just 6 months before I met him. One day he thought he had the flu. A few scans later, he was told he had metastatic cancer in his bones, liver, and lungs. By the time he arrived on hospice, he had lost weight, was in constant pain, and could barely eat. The changes were dramatic, disorienting for him and his family. "How did this happen so fast?" his daughter whispered through tears. That's the nature of many acute illnesses at the end of life. They don't give much warning and they don't give much time. There's grief not just in the dying, but in the speed at which life gets taken away. Then there's the other kind of patient, someone who's been living with disease for decades, chronic illness. These folks have traveled a much longer road, and the decline is less like a cliff and more like a winding path that slowly narrows. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, heart failure, advanced COPD. These are diseases that reshape a person gradually. They lose things bit by bit. Memory, strength, mobility, independence. I've walked this road with many families, and I can tell you, this kind of loss is its own kind of heartbreak. One man I cared for, Mr. R, had been diagnosed with Parkinson's almost 20 years earlier. His wife had become his caregiver long before hospice entered the picture. She adjusted to each stage, first the tremors, then the falls, then the confusion, and eventually the silence. By the time I met her, she was exhausted, grieving the man he once was, yet still deeply devoted. She told me, "I've been saying goodbye for years." That's what chronic illness does. It takes a little at a time until one day, there's not much left to take. These two kinds of illness ask different things of us. They call for different kinds of support, different ways of preparing, and different expectations about how the end will come. But both deserve the same presence, the same care, the same love. In the next part, I'll walk you through how these dying processes unfold, the patterns we often see, and how understanding them can help families make sense of what's happening. Because when we understand the nature of a decline, we are better equipped to meet it with compassion, not confusion. Over the years, I've come to recognize the distinct shapes that different illnesses take at the end of life. It's not always black and white, but there are patterns. Ones I've seen again and again. When someone is dying from an acute illness like metastatic cancer, the decline tends to be swift and steady. Imagine a slope, sometimes gentle at first, sometimes sharp, but always downward. Once the illness begins to take over, the body starts letting go. Appetite fades, weight drops, energy drains, and then comes the pain, the confusion, the fatigue. It all happens in what feels like fast motion. Families often find themselves playing catch-up, trying to understand what's happening as it unfolds. There's little time to process, to adjust. Medically speaking, this makes hospice enrollment more straightforward. The symptoms are measurable, the prognosis clearer. Medicare requires that we reasonably believe a patient has 6 months or less to live. With aggressive, late-stage cancers, that's usually not hard to justify. The evidence is visible, both on paper and in the room. I remember a woman named Clara. She had breast cancer that spread to her brain and bones. She had been managing well, even working part-time, until one day she couldn't keep her balance. Within 2 months, she was bedbound and barely responsive. Her husband told me, "I feel like I just lost her, even though she's still here." That's the kind of emotional whiplash acute illness can cause. It steals someone quickly, without time to brace for the loss. Chronic illness, on the other hand, moves differently. The decline isn't a slope, it's a staircase. A person may stay at one level of functioning for months or years. Then something happens, a urinary tract infection, a bout of pneumonia, a fall, and they drop to a new level. Sometimes they recover partially, sometimes they don't, but they rarely bounce back to where they were. Each event chips away at their reserves. Hospice enrollment in these cases can be tricky. The changes are subtle, the timeline unclear. We have to gather evidence, how much weight they've lost, how little they eat, how often they're hospitalized. It takes more work to make the case that the person likely has less than 6 months, even when everyone in the room senses it's true. There was one gentleman, a former engineer with advanced COPD, who came onto hospice after his 3rd hospitalization in 6 months. He couldn't climb the stairs in his home anymore. He barely spoke without getting winded. And yet, a week into hospice with oxygen and comfort care, he started eating more and even chuckled at a joke. "He looks better than ever," his son said. It's not uncommon. That's what hospice does sometimes. It stabilizes, brings comfort, even revives a little. But in chronic illness, that upward motion is usually short-lived. Sooner or later, another drop comes. And that's what I want to prepare families for, not just the final moment, but the shape of the path. Acute illnesses often give you less time, but clearer signs. Chronic illnesses give you more time, but cloudier signals. Neither is easy. But when we know what to expect, we can stop trying to measure each day by the number of breaths, and instead begin to measure it by the presence, the tenderness, the meaning we bring to each one. Next, I'll talk about what symptoms might show up along the way, and how we as caregivers and family members can be ready to respond with knowledge, grace, and calm. One of the things families often ask me is what to expect symptom-wise. Will it hurt? Will she suffer? These are not easy questions, but they're important ones. Because how someone looks and feels in their final weeks can shape how we remember them and how we carry our grief after they're gone. In my experience, patients with acute illnesses often experience a more intense and visible range of symptoms. Advanced cancers, for instance, can bring significant pain, difficulty breathing, nausea, fatigue, and even confusion as the disease spreads or affects the brain. The body is overwhelmed quickly, and it doesn't have much time to adjust. I think of Peter, a jazz musician in his 60s who came to hospice with advanced liver cancer. Within a week, he was curled up in bed, wincing with every movement, his breathing labored. He told me, "It's like my whole body is at war with itself." We worked hard to manage his pain, to find the right balance of medications so he could be awake enough to hear his grandchildren play piano, but not in agony. That's the delicate work of hospice. Not just to prolong life, but to protect the quality of the time that remains. Chronic illnesses are different. The symptoms may be just as real, but often less dramatic. The body, after years of decline, learns to compensate. Someone with end-stage heart failure may be short of breath, but they've learned how to pace their speech, how to sit just right to ease the pressure. A person with COPD knows when to rest and when to breathe through pursed lips. Someone with Alzheimer's may no longer speak, but their body knows how to quiet itself when comforted with a familiar touch or voice. In some ways, this adaptation is a gift. It allows the patient to carry on longer with dignity and less visible suffering. But it can also make it harder for families to recognize how far the illness has progressed. She still has good days, they'll say, and she does. But those good days are not the same as healing. They're pauses between the steps down. Take Eleanor, for example. She had late-stage dementia, and by the time we met, she no longer spoke, barely ate, and spent most of her days sleeping. Her daughter, who had cared for her for over a decade, asked me gently one morning, "Is she dying now, or is this just another one of her quiet spells?" It's a question I've heard many times, because when the illness has taken so much already, it can be hard to know when the final letting go begin. But when the body enters what we call the actively dying phase, regardless of whether the illness was acute or chronic, the signs become more unified, less about the disease itself and more about the body's natural process of shutting down. Most patients will become unresponsive, drifting in and out of consciousness before settling into a deep, quiet state. Breathing changes, sometimes becoming irregular, with long pauses between breaths, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep and labored. The death rattle, a gurgling sound caused by secretions the body can no longer clear, may begin. It's one of the sounds families fear most, but I always reassure them it's more distressing to hear than to feel. The person is not suffering. Their mind is no longer interpreting the sensations the way ours would. Skin color may change, hands and feet cool, turning mottled or bluish. The body pulls blood inward, conserving what little energy remains for the heart and brain. All of this is not a failure of care. It is nature's rhythm, as ancient and instinctual as birth itself. I remember holding the hand of a man named Leo, whose aggressive cancer had stolen his voice just days before. He hadn't spoken in hours and his breathing had grown shallow. His daughter sat beside him, tears streaming down her face. "He's still my dad," she whispered. And she was right. Even in those final hours when speech had ceased and the body was winding down, his presence filled the room. There was something sacred about it, a quiet recognition that the end was near and that love still had its place, even in silence. That's the truth I've seen again and again. While the roads to dying may differ, their final stretch is remarkably alike. The body, no matter its history, moves toward death in much the same way. And while this stage can be frightening to witness, it is also the moment where care, comfort, and presence matter most. In the final part, I'd like to share what hospice can offer during this time. What comfort looks like not only for the person dying, but for those who remain. Because death, in all its mystery, is not just about the ending. It's about how we accompany one another across the threshold. I've often said that hospice is not a place, it's a philosophy of care, and perhaps more importantly, a way of being with people at the most vulnerable point in their lives. When the focus shifts from curing to comforting, from prolonging life to preserving its quality, hospice steps in not to take over, but to walk alongside. During the actively dying phase, there's very little left for medicine to fix, but there's still so much we can do. We ease pain, manage symptoms, calm the body, support the soul, and hold space for the family. That's the work of hospice. Pain is often the first fear people have, and rightly so. But I want to be clear, hospice is exceptionally good at managing pain, whether it's through morphine, anti-anxiety medications, gentle repositioning, or simply being present. Our goal is always to prevent suffering, We monitor closely not just for physical discomfort, but for signs of restlessness, shortness of breath, and anxiety, adjusting medications as needed, often several times a day. But hospice goes far beyond medication. We bring calm into a room that's often full of fear. A nurse might sit quietly by the bedside, showing a daughter how to moisten her mother's lips. A social worker might gently guide a husband through what to expect next, helping him find the words to say goodbye. A chaplain might sit with the family not to preach, but to listen, to hold the spiritual weight of a moment when language sometimes fails. I remember a patient named Ruth. She had end-stage heart disease and had declined slowly over several years. Her son was her main caregiver, just the two of them, in a quiet little apartment filled with plants and old jazz records. When Ruth entered the final days of life, the hospice team visited daily, sometimes twice a day. The nurse made sure Ruth was comfortable and gently explained each change her body was going through. The aide bathed her and brushed her hair, giving her dignity even when she couldn't ask for it. And the chaplain sat with her son on the balcony one afternoon while Ruth slept, just to remind him that he wasn't alone. That's what hospice does. We see the person, not just the patient. We support the family, not just the body. We help people write their last chapter in a way that honors who they are. And even after death, the care continues. Hospice provides bereavement support for months afterward. Grief doesn't follow a calendar, and we don't expect it to. Families are often surprised by this. "You're still here?" they ask when we check in weeks or months later. Yes, we are still here, because we believe that how someone is cared for in dying directly affects how their loved ones go on living. So when people ask me, what does hospice really do, I tell them we hold space for love to have the last word. We care not just for the dying, but for the living who must carry that goodbye with them. We may not be able to change the destination, but we can soften the road. We can make room for meaning, for connection, for peace. And that, in the end, is everything. If you've stayed with me through this conversation, thank you. I know these are not easy things to think about. None of us are in a rush to talk about dying. But what I've learned after all these years is that the more we understand it, the less power fear has over us. Death is not the enemy, it's a part of the story. And like any important chapter, it deserves to be met with honesty, tenderness, and care. Whether your loved one is facing a fast-moving illness or has been declining slowly over many years, know this: there is no right or wrong way to walk this road. What matters is presence. What matters is love. And you don't have to do it alone. Hospice is here, not to give up, but to hold on to comfort, to meaning, to dignity, and to each other. My hope is that this video has helped you feel a little more prepared, a little more grounded, and maybe even a little more at peace. Take care of yourself, and if you're walking with someone you love toward the end of their life, take heart. You're doing sacred work.